The recording is 11 seconds long. Before you hear it, understand something. The people who received this audio file were told to expect an alarm, a malfunction, some kind of mechanical failure on a boat that had drifted off course near Cape Canaveral. That is not what they heard. What came through their headphones was a sound the human ear was never built to process. A wailing so constant, so raw, that at first it just sounds like static, like feedback. Then your brain catches up to what it's actually hearing, and you realize the sound isn't coming from a machine at all. It's coming from 8 human throats, screaming at the absolute limit of what a throat can survive. 200 people sat in a university auditorium in Florida and listened to that recording. By the time it ended, 2,000 of them had already walked out. The 200 who stayed signed a document that made sure the world would never hear this story. Until now. 6 days earlier, something entered the Atlantic Ocean 2 miles off the coast of Cape Canaveral. Nobody saw it fall. No fireball, no impact site, no debris field for satellites to track. One moment, the water near the coast was empty. The next, a 60-foot yacht was drifting toward the beach near the Kennedy Space Center with nobody visibly steering it. A local fisherman called it, and around 6 a.m., search and rescue sent a 2-person team to check on what they assumed was an abandoned vessel, maybe a mechanical failure, maybe a medical emergency on board. Routine work, the kind of call these teams answer a dozen times a year. The search and rescue team never radioed back. 90 minutes later, the Coast Guard sent a second team, this time in full hazmat gear, because whatever had happened to the first team had happened fast enough that nobody wanted to guess at the cause before seeing it firsthand. That second team is the one whose body camera footage would end up playing in a university auditorium 6 days later, in front of 2,500 strangers who had answered a job posting without knowing what the job actually was. The man responsible for showing them that footage was Dr. Elias Renner, a mid-career physician who ran a private research hospital outside Orlando. Renner hadn't asked for this job. 3 separate federal agencies had shown up at his hospital within the same week, and by the end of that week, he'd been handed a title nobody wanted, director. Renner had spent the 6 days since the yacht incident doing something he never expected to do in his career. He'd been building a recruitment pipeline, quietly through ethics classes, online debate forums, community college job boards, anywhere a person might be looking for fast money and wouldn't ask too many questions before showing up. He told himself it wasn't dishonest. Technically, every word in those postings was true. Compensation was accurate. Benefits were accurate. The word confidential was doing an enormous amount of work, but it wasn't a lie. None of the postings mentioned a location. None of them mentioned a timeline longer than a single day. A few candidates later admitted they'd assumed it was some kind of marketing stunt, maybe for a video game studio or a reality show pilot. Renner let that assumption stand every time it came up. Correcting it meant explaining what the job actually was, and he wasn't authorized to do that outside a locked auditorium. While the postings circulated, construction crews worked around the clock on something else, a hospital that didn't officially exist yet. Built on a converted platform, 11 miles off the Florida coast, far enough out that commercial fishing boats were quietly rerouted around it under the cover of a fabricated environmental survey. Renner had seen the blueprints exactly once, during a video call with 3 men whose names he was never given. 42 beds, reinforced isolation wings, an incinerator large enough to handle materials that couldn't be transported anywhere else. He believed his own justification right up until the morning of the presentation, when he stood backstage in a university auditorium and watched 2,500 people take their seats, most of them having no idea that within the hour, 500 of them would walk out shaking, and 200 would stay behind to volunteer for something that didn't have a name yet. In the days leading up to the presentation, Renner's own staff had started asking questions he couldn't answer honestly. A handful of them had clearance to know fragments of the project, and those fragments were enough to keep them awake at night. Renner knew this because he'd arranged, with help from a federal contact, to have his research building wired with microphones. He told himself it was standard security protocol. He listened anyway, alone in his office most nights, to the same 3 questions cycling through hallway conversations. Is this crazy? Are we doing the right thing? Is there any other option? He understood the questions. He'd asked himself the same ones on a loop since the night he first saw the yacht footage. What he never told his staff, what he could never bring himself to say out loud to anyone, was that he'd stopped believing there was a version of this that ended without people like the librarian on an operating table. The auditorium held 2,500 people that morning. A quarter of them were students at the university. The rest had come from job postings scattered across community colleges and social media pages that never mentioned what the position actually involved. Renner walked to the podium a few minutes past 9. He was a short man, unremarkable in a polo shirt and khakis, the kind of person you'd walk past in a grocery store without a second glance. The dark circles under his eyes told a different story to anyone close enough to see them. "Thank you for coming," he said. "Before we begin, I need to give you the only warning you'll receive today." He explained the process. Non-disclosure agreements signed in layers. Each layer would unlock a little more information, and once you signed the first one, you were tied to this project for good. If you want to leave with no strings attached, now is the time, he said. You'll have other chances to walk away after this, but only if you're willing to walk away from $10,000 and a level of security most people never get in their lives. 200 people left before the first document was even passed around. The remaining 2,300 signed without much hesitation. A few of them signed twice, joking that they wanted extra copies for their scrapbooks. Renner didn't laugh. He'd stopped finding anything about this funny days ago. The lights dimmed. A slideshow appeared behind him, thrown together in a hurry, mostly plain text on white backgrounds. He told them about the yacht, the missing search and rescue team, the Coast Guard crew sent in after them, wearing full protective suits because nobody wanted to repeat whatever mistake had just been made. Then he told them he was going to play a short clip of audio recorded by the hazmat team's body cameras. Another wave of people stood and left before the recording even started. Most of the room stayed. The audio opened with waves lapping against a hull, voices confirming positions, standard boat chatter. Underneath, all of it sat a high, constant tone that most listeners assumed was some kind of equipment alarm. It wasn't an alarm. By the time the 11 seconds finished playing, 20 of the 2,500 original seats were still occupied by people who hadn't yet processed what they'd heard. The rest of the room understood immediately, and the room emptied out fast, chairs slamming up against their backs, people pushing past each other to get to the doors. Renner waited until the room settled. Roughly 500 people remained. "I hope you understand," he said, his voice carrying across all the empty seats, "that what we are dealing with requires absolute secrecy. The next agreement will bind you legally to silence for the remainder of your life. This is both a request and a promise. Before we show you the footage." 200 people signed that document. The rest left. The 200 who stayed were shown the video. It came from a chest-mounted camera on a woman standing near the front of the hazmat team's boat. The screaming had already worn the victims down by that point in the footage. What came through now wasn't screaming anymore. It was something closer to choking, wet and constant, the sound of people trying to scream through throats that had already torn themselves apart. "This is messed up," a voice said off camera. "No kidding," the camera woman answered, gripping the safety rail with a thick yellow glove. The yacht came into view, 60 feet of hull painted in green and yellow patterns that curled like vines. Nobody was visible on the front sections. As the response boat circled toward the stern, the source of the sound finally appeared. 8 people, 4 from the original yacht crew, 4 from the missing search and rescue team, all of them curled into fetal positions on the back platform of the boat, arms locked tight across their chests, eyes squeezed shut, legs kicking wildly against the deck as if trying to run while lying down. Voices argued behind the camera, barely audible, requiring subtitles to follow. "I'm not getting any closer. We have to help them. It's what we signed up for. I didn't sign up to die. What if it gets through our suits?" Eventually, one crew member volunteered. The camera watched him climb onto the yacht alone, take a few careful steps, then call back that his suit hadn't torn. He confirmed 2 Coast Guard members were unaccounted for. Nobody in that auditorium needed the footage spelled out for them to guess what that meant. One civilian remained on the yacht when a wave rocked the boat and knocked him into the water. For a few seconds, his body thrashed violently against the surface. Then it went still. The water calmed. Slowly, deliberately, he exhaled every bit of air from his lungs and sank beneath the surface, swimming down instead of up. The last thing the footage showed was the volunteer disconnecting his own respirator to dive in after the drowning man. The instant open air touched his face, he froze. Then he dropped to the deck, convulsing, screaming in a voice that hadn't existed a second earlier. The video ended there. Renner returned to the podium looking paler than when he'd left it. "We don't know what this is," he told the 200 remaining candidates. "We've tested everything within 30 feet of that yacht. No virus, no bacteria, no known medium of transmission. And yet it moves through open air. And once someone is exposed, they lose control of their body instantly. He gripped the podium microphone. "We need your help to study this. Before I explain further, we're going to break into small groups for individual interviews to see who is willing to move forward." Dr. Renner volunteered to lead one of those interview groups himself. The room was a small campus classroom, cold enough that most of the 5 remaining candidates kept their jackets zipped to the chin. 3 armed guards stood near the door, a decision made by the Department of Defense, not by Renner. One candidate spoke up first, a university student in his early 20s, a plaid shirt and a topknot, his hands shaking slightly in his lap. "Human experiments," he said. "That's what this is. You need people for human experiments." Renner nodded. He'd been pressing his fingernails into his palm for the last hour, a habit he'd developed to keep his hands from shaking in front of strangers. "The infected all died within 48 hours, he said. "Every one of them, from brain aneurysms, in the exact order they were exposed. The yacht passengers first, then the response team, then the volunteer who tried to save the last manual." A woman beside the student raised her hand before speaking, an old habit from decades of classrooms. She worked as a librarian, mid-40s, with streaks of purple through her gray hair. "Why do you need us?" she asked. "What is it you actually want us to do?" Renner explained the first part. An offshore medical facility built off the coast in the last 6 days that needed staff at every level, from registered nurses down to janitorial workers. "That seems like a lot of security for something that only spreads within a small radius," said a bald man in his late 30s, sitting with his arms crossed. He'd introduced himself earlier as a construction foreman. "You're right," Renner said. "If that was the entire situation, none of this would be necessary." He gestured at the guards by the door. "But there's one more detail about the infection I haven't told you yet." He explained it carefully. Every trace of an infected person's body, even after death, radiated something that could infect anyone who came within roughly 12 feet. A piece of skin the size of a fingernail, sitting alone in a sterile room, could kill someone who got too close. And despite every scan available to modern medicine, nothing showed up. No radiation signature, no unusual cell activity, nothing on an X-ray or an MRI. In the 6 days since the yacht, 30 more people had died testing the boundaries of that radius. 2 of them had been friends of Renner's. "Only 2 people have shown anything different," he continued, and slid 2 photographs onto the table. One showed an elderly man. The other showed a young girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old. This man had advanced Alzheimer's and had signed a consent form for emergency testing before his condition worsened. This girl wandered into an open surgical suite where testing was taking place. Neither of them died the way the others did. The room went quiet. "What happened to them?" the librarian asked. "Cerebral hemorrhage, not a standard aneurysm." The Alzheimer's patient talked to himself for hours before it happened, seemingly unaware of what was going on around him. The girl showed no symptoms at all until she simply collapsed. "That's who you want us to test on," the librarian said. It wasn't a question. Nobody in the room raised their voice. Renner had expected shouting, accusations, maybe someone standing up and walking out. Instead, all 4 remaining candidates looked down at the photographs, then back up at him, waiting for him to keep talking. We were unable to track the full scope of this, Renner said. New infection sites are appearing along the eastern seaboard faster than we can respond to them. Several states are already treating their coastlines as a state of emergency. Just say what you actually need, the construction foreman said, his voice cracking slightly. Were we picked because you had files on us? Did you look me up because I've got a daughter? You were selected randomly, Renner said, though the half-truth cost him something to say out loud. Given what we're asking, we need people open to the idea. I promise you, if there was another option, we would take it. Whatever needs to happen will happen with as much care as we can manage. Why not use death row inmates? The student asked. That's how it works in every movie. Renner had actually fought for that option weeks earlier. The problem, according to his contacts overseas, was that death row meant wildly different things depending on the country, and using an international pool meant risking political prisoners or wrongfully convicted people ending up in the program. Domestically, the legal protections around death row inmates turned out to be more restrictive than almost anyone in the room could imagine. There's nobody more protected by red tape than people already inside the legal system, Renner said instead. What about animals? Primates? The librarian asked. This only affects humans, Renner said. Every other species we've exposed shows no reaction at all. The student leaned forward, arms braced on his knees. How does it even spread if there's nothing to measure? No signal, no particles, nothing on a scan. That doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to us either, Renner admitted. The working theory, and I want to stress that it's only a theory, is that whatever this is doesn't interact with matter the way we understand interaction. It interacts with something else, something none of our instruments are built to detect. Something like what? The librarian pressed. Renner hesitated long enough that the guards by the door shifted their weight. We don't have a word for it yet, he said. The 2 survivors who lasted longer than everyone else, the man with Alzheimer's and the girl, both had one thing in common we didn't expect. Their brain scans, before exposure, already showed unusual activity in regions tied to memory and self-recognition. We think that difference is why they reacted differently. We don't know why yet. That's what the facility is for. The construction foreman's composure finally cracked. And what happens when you run out of old folks and people with disabilities? Because that's what my daughter would be to you people. Just leftover material that got a bad draw. No, Renner said, wiping his own eye before he realized he was doing it. They will be remembered for what they gave. We're just not able to say that publicly yet, because right now, there might not be anyone left to remember them. Nobody argued after that. The librarian was first to reach for the pen. Renner, against every instinct telling him to stay quiet, asked her one question before she signed. What convinced you? She capped and uncapped the pen twice before answering. If we learned as much as we did from horrible experiments in the past, isn't this just the next version of that? We're asking some people to sacrifice for everyone else. At least this time, they won't know It's happening to them the way we do right now. That has to count for something, doesn't it? It does, Renner said. Exactly that. He shook her hand, and something in his chest told him this was the last normal conversation he was going to have with her. Every interview group reported the same result. Nobody pushed back hard enough to derail the recruitment. The candidates who'd made it this far had already decided, somewhere between the auditorium and this classroom, that someone else's sacrifice was an acceptable price for their own survival. Out in the hallway, once the interviews wrapped, armed guards moved through the building and sedated every candidate who had signed. None of them were told that part was coming. The 200 woke up in stages over the following 6 hours, not all at once, spread across a converted medical bay that still smelled faintly of the fresh paint used to cover its original industrial markings. A nurse moved bed to bed with a penlight and a clipboard, checking pupil response, confirming names against a printed roster. Nobody remembered the transfer itself. One moment, they'd been sitting in a cold classroom signing a stack of papers, and the next, they were staring at a ceiling made of corrugated steel, feeling the unmistakable, low-frequency sway of something floating on open water. The platform had been an oil rig 18 months earlier, according to a maintenance worker who let that detail slip during breakfast on the first morning, before catching himself and refusing to say another word about it. Whatever conversion had taken place since then had been fast and thorough. Hospital corridors ran where drilling equipment used to sit. A cafeteria occupied what had once been a break room for a crew a fraction of the size of the 200 now living there. Nobody was allowed past the second floor without an escort. The elevator required a badge that none of the candidates had been issued yet. Twice during that first week, the entire medical bay heard an alarm sound from somewhere below them. 3 short tones followed by silence, and twice the staff on duty gave the exact same answer when asked about it. Routine equipment check. Nobody believed that answer by the second time they heard it. The librarian settled into a bunk near the far wall, 3 beds down from the student, close enough that the 2 of them fell into an easy, quiet friendship built on shared uncertainty. She kept mostly to herself otherwise, spending her free hours in the small library the facility had assembled for staff morale. A single bookshelf salvaged from somewhere and stocked with paperbacks nobody had chosen carefully. On the 5th night, she was called by name over the intercom and asked to report to processing. She was the first candidate selected for what the paperwork referred to only as Phase 1. The librarian's name was Marisol. Nobody at the facility used it. To the staff, to the guards, and eventually to Renner himself, she became simply the librarian, a label that made it easier for everyone involved to do what came next. She didn't remember the sedation taking hold, or the 2-hour boat transfer out to the platform, or being carried through a corridor lined with staff who avoided looking directly at her stretcher. The last clear memory she had was capping a pen after signing her name, and Renner's voice telling her she was exactly right. Everything after that arrived in fragments. A blood pressure cuff tightening around her arm. A voice reading numbers to someone else in the room. A cold gel spread across her scalp before a series of electrodes were pressed into place, one at a time. each one accompanied by a small, apologetic murmur from whoever was attaching them. Then there was no more waking world to return to. She woke up somewhere that wasn't quite a place at all. Grass under her feet, wet with dew, the sound of children playing somewhere behind her. Ahead of her stood a white picket fence. Then, without any sensation of movement, the fence became a concrete barrier, and then a rotted wooden fence covered in graffiti she couldn't read. The sky refused to hold a single color, cycling through blue, then orange, then a deep bruised purple. She understood, somewhere in the back of her mind, that this was a dream. The realization sharpened everything around her for a moment, sound and color snapping into focus with unnatural clarity. Then the clarity dissolved, and she was 5 years old again, crawling across an orange carpet toward a couch that became a door, that became the body of a dead deer lying in the middle of the living room. She screamed as the deer's ribs shifted, as it rose onto back legs that ended in cloven hooves, as long black fur crept down arms it shouldn't have had, arms that reached for her and pulled her into an embrace she had no strength to resist. The dream shifted again. She was 10, sitting at a restaurant booth, being served ice cream by her grandmother, dead for 11 years now. Her skin the same gray powder color as the makeup they'd used at her funeral. Marisol tried to scream this time and found she couldn't. All she could do was squeeze her eyes shut, hold herself as tightly as her arms would allow, until she'd forgotten why her eyes were shut in the first place, until the memory of her own fear became a stranger's memory instead of her own. The dream folded again, and this time she stood in her own library, the one she'd worked in for 18 years, except every shelf had been emptied and every book replaced with a single photograph. Over and over, thousands of copies of the same 2 pictures Renner had shown her. The old man, the little girl. She walked the aisles pulling photograph after photograph off the shelves, and no matter how many she removed, the shelves stayed exactly as full as they'd started. Somewhere behind the last aisle, she heard her own voice, the one she'd used in that classroom, asking a question she never got an answer to. What convinced you? Only now, it wasn't Renner's voice answering back. It was her own, layered under itself dozens of times, repeating the same 4 words until they stopped sounding like words at all. If you slowed the sound around her down, stretched it out across the hours she spent trapped inside that place, it would have eventually formed words. A voice, calm and clinical, speaking from somewhere outside the dream entirely. The infection has taken hold. Begin the first round of tests. Marisol never woke up in any conventional sense. For 6 days, the observation team recorded her vitals every 15 minutes. Her brain activity spiked and dipped in patterns nobody on staff had ever documented before, cycling through what the monitoring equipment classified as REM, sleep, despite the fact that her eyes never opened once during the entire 6 days. On the 7th day, at 4:12 in the morning, her heart simply stopped. No aneurysm, no hemorrhage, no trauma of any kind that the autopsy could identify. Her brain, according to the report Renner read 3 times, before he could bring himself to sign off on it. Showed activity in regions that shouldn't have been active during unconsciousness at all. Regions responsible for decision-making. Regions responsible for recognizing another person's face. The technical team wrote it off as an anomaly. Renner never did. He kept a photograph of her interview consent form in his desk drawer for the rest of his time at the facility. The one where she'd asked him what convinced him to keep going with all of this. He never had an honest answer to give her. Not that night, and not afterward. The construction foreman lasted 4 months on the platform before requesting reassignment to a records position onshore. His daughter never learned what he'd actually spent that time doing. He told her he'd worked as a hospital administrator, and as far as anyone can confirm, he kept that story consistent until his death, decades later, from causes that had nothing to do with the project. The student stayed the longest of anyone from that first classroom interview. He rose to a supervisory role within 2 years, training incoming staff on protocols nobody outside the platform would ever need to know. Colleagues who worked under him described him as thorough, even kind, in a way that never quite matched what the job required of him. Nobody who worked there long ever fully explained how those two things existed in the same person. The offshore facility stayed operational for another 11 months. During that time, 47 more candidates went through the same process Marisol did. Government records, the small number that have ever surfaced, list all of them under case numbers instead of names. Whatever entered the Atlantic that morning off Cape Canaveral was never publicly identified. No official statement was ever released. The families of the missing search and rescue and Coast Guard members were told their loved ones died in a training accident. A story none of them ever fully believed, and none of them were ever able to prove wrong. The Eastern Seaboard infection sites Renner mentioned during the interviews never made the news. If you ask coastal emergency services in certain counties about unusual protocols still buried in their older files, most of them will tell you they don't know what you're talking about. Some of them are telling the truth. The people who could tell you otherwise all signed something that made sure they never would. Renner left the project 11 months after Marisol's death, transferred to a research position that kept him far from any coastline for the rest of his career. Colleagues who worked with him afterward described a man who flinched at loud alarms and refused, without explanation, to ever set foot on a boat again. He gave exactly one interview about his time on the platform, decades later, to a journalist who agreed to withhold his real name. In it, he was asked what the infection actually turned out to be after all those months of testing. His answer, according to the journalist's notes, was 3 words long: "We never found out." The platform itself was decommissioned 4 years after it opened, its equipment stripped, its staff reassigned or quietly retired with settlements attached to permanent silence clauses. Satellite imagery from that stretch of coast, the kind anyone can pull up today, shows nothing where the structure used to sit. No wreckage, no debris field, just water, the same as it looked the morning before any of this happened. Nobody has ever confirmed what came out of that ocean, what it actually was, or why 2 people out of dozens seemed able to resist it, even for a little while, even in a dream. The official record calls it an unexplained maritime incident and leaves it there, somewhere in a records warehouse none of us will ever get clearance to enter. A case file still exists under a name that isn't Marisol's, and somewhere off the coast of Florida, in water that looks exactly like every other stretch of ocean on that coastline. Whatever came out of it that morning has never been found again. That doesn't mean it never came back. If a story like this keeps you up wondering what actually happens behind the doors marked classified, you're exactly the kind of person this channel was built for. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Drop a like if this one got under your skin, and let me know in the comments what you think really came out of that water.